Before we begin, just a few housekeeping points. As I mentioned to you, this session is being recorded. Thanks to Emily from the German American Business Council for taking care of the technical side of things for us. Please mute yourself to minimize background noise. And if you would like to ask any questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. With that, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ursula, and thank you to the Women in Trade in New England group for putting this event together. I'm so honored to have been invited to moderate this conversation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to it. We are joined today by two wonderful, very knowledgeable women who will be sharing with us their knowledge on this matter, and I'd like to give just a little bit of context about this. So, as you all know, the WTO is in the process, as Ursula mentioned, of electing a new Director General after Mr. Roberto Acevedo announced he would be stepping down from that position at the end of his mandate, which expired last August 31st. There are now 8 candidates for the job, and there's a lot of expectation around this election, as it appears to be deeply consequential for the future of international trade. But why is it so, and how have we come to this being a very momentous election? Why is it of so much importance not only to know who will be elected, but what they and the organization are able to work immediately on and then for the future? So thankfully, to clarify all of this, as I was saying, we're joined today by two amazing women leaders in their field in international trade, and who will be sharing today their experience and their perspective on this matter. So I'm very happy to introduce first Andrew Durkin, who is the founder and principal of the independent consulting firm Sparkplug, and editor-in-chief of the trade specialized website Trade Vistas, of which she will share some information with us in a little while. Andrew is also currently the president of the Association of Women in International Trade in Washington, D.C., and she previously served as a U.S. government trade negotiator. She has taught international trade policy and negotiation for the last 15 years as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program. So Andrea, thank you so much for your time today here. I am also very happy and honored to introduce Dr. Inu Manak, who is a research fellow at the Cato Institute, focusing on the WTO, non-judicial treaty mechanisms, technical barriers to trade, regional trade agreement, and development. She also currently sits in the executive and editorial boards of another wonderful network of women who work in international trade, the Trade Experts. Previously, she was a junior visiting fellow at the Center for Trade and Economic Integration at the Graduate Institute, and fellow at Trade Lab, a Geneva-based NGO which assists developing countries, SMEs, and NGOs to build legal capacity in trade and investment law. Thank you, Inu, also for being here today. So to begin this conversation, Andrea, if I can first ask you, could you provide a brief overview that helps us understand what's at stake here, what the WTO represents and the broad strokes of its functioning? And also, I know that you have some very valuable information that you have recently gathered that speaks to the value of having an organization as the WTO that's fully functional.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to Leslie and Ursula as well. I'm so pleased to join this group today to meet everybody up in New England. Leslie's been a friend for many years, so I feel like I'm getting to, since she moved, I get to meet all her new friends via this platform, which is great. You mentioned, Barbara, that I've been teaching at Georgetown for the last 15 years. And I have to say that when I first started off teaching, my focus was on sort of the handoff, right? Teaching what is, here's what's been negotiated, here's the history, here's what you take forward. And then somewhere along the way, I realized that you can't just teach what is. You have to teach the students how to innovate in trade policy, how to pivot with policy institutions that need to evolve to meet the needs of today. That's what we're trying to teach them, and that's really defines the moment I think that we're in with the WTO right now, because the stasis or drift or however you want to characterize it of the WTO right now basically means that it's not serving its members as well as it could, which of course incentivizes them to go out and negotiate deals outside of the WTO. It means that trade policy and agreements aren't keeping up with the modern economy, not covering services as well as it could, not covering digital, et cetera. And I think of equal importance, it also means that some of the rules, particularly the ones pertaining to subsidies that were negotiated before China entered the WTO, are also potentially inadequate or insufficient to address China's pervasive state involvement in its own economy, which of course, because it's so large, affects so many sectors of the global economy. So in order to think about, the title of the program is What's Next for the WTO, I think you have to get back to first principles in a lot of respects, and understand what the WTO's founding principles are all about, and buy into the value of those founding principles so that you can evolve the institution and policies on that basis. And you're right, I wanted to share with you some polling that Trade Vistas did recently, because very few Americans are actually familiar with this. I don't know if that's how you could characterize citizenry around the world, but certainly it's important for American policymakers anyway, trade policymakers, to have support from the American public if they're going to evolve this institution in ways that the American public will support. So we did some polling in July, and I'll ask Emily to bring up the slides, and I'll just take you through that very, very quickly. You can go to the next slide where the results begin. We did the polling because maybe some don't know, and I don't think I knew this for a long time, but the implementing bill for the WTO in the United States, the implementing bill actually required or allowed for a vote every 5 years according to certain procedures as to whether the United States should stay in the WTO. Now, the voting procedures were basically set up to ensure that probably wouldn't happen. But I think this summer we came as close as we ever have to actually having a vote on it, because there was bipartisan support for a resolution to leave the WTO. So we wanted to know if that had happened, would those members of Congress have had support for that from ordinary Americans? So we asked these questions. We asked, first of all, do you support or oppose the United States leaving the WTO? And this indifferent and not sure, so it was 17% indifferent, 18% unsure. Actually, that would add up to 25, wouldn't it? But or 35 there. So somewhere I got the numbers a little bit wrong. So 36% fall in this indifferent or not sure category. And 36% would support strongly or somewhat support leaving the WTO. So really that's a plurality. That leaves just 28% of respondents saying that they would oppose leaving the WTO. So there's a clear opening, right? And yeah, stay on that slide for 1 second. There's a clear opening for anybody who's intensely motivated, right, to want the United States to leave the WTO. Now, the second question I think is a little more optimistic in its outcome. When people feel they understand the role of the WTO, they're more likely to be supportive of it and of US membership in it. So if you frame it as it's an organization that enforces voluntarily agreed rules, and that prevents foreign governments from being unfair to American businesses, if you ask them if you believe that's true, then the majority of Americans believe the WTO probably does play that role. Now you can go to the next slide. So if that's true, and if it's also true, which it is, and you can see from this next question, that most Americans, almost 80% here, believe that the US should lead in the global economy, then the question becomes, does the WTO help us play that role? But here's where it gets shaky again, because among those who think we should leave, their answers really align with the belief that they tend to believe that leaving the WTO would not diminish the US's ability to lead. 31% essentially think leaving wouldn't make a difference, or they were unsure. So really, about a quarter said that they think leaving would hurt the US's standing. So where does that leave us all, right? I don't think any of these numbers would surprise anybody particularly, but I think what it tells you is there's no groundswell or a strong movement to leave the WTO. Mostly people are just unsure. of what it does. And I think that indifference is actually a litlittle bit dangerous. You know, when you think about some of the polling around TPP, for example, when President Trump pulled out of TPP, you know, the polls at that time showed that 77% of the American population had never heard of it, didn't know what it did. So they're not going to miss it if we leave it, if they don't know what it is. And that's the fear, you know, I'm trying to identify here, is that if we don't value or appreciate or understand what the WTO does, Americans may allow something like that to happen without appreciating the harm that it could do. So we can go to the next slide. I won't spend too much time on slides, I promise. I just have a couple of more, maybe 3 more. Ursula had asked if I could talk for a minute about what the WTO does, and I won't spend much time here, but just to highlight and reiterate that, of course, there are 3 core functions, at least. I've listed 4 here, but the main 3 really are that it serves as a forum for trade negotiations, right? The members negotiate. As a UN body, it really stays true to allowing the membership to make decisions, but it serves as the forum for global trade negotiations. It settles trade disputes, and we can talk a little bit more about what's happening in the dispute settlement function. And then it serves an administrative, really, really important administrative function. It monitors implementation, and it's not to say that the Secretariat does that. What's really important, I think, about this function is that it relies on transparency and notifications. And these committee meetings are, you know, a tremendous and underrated opportunity for governments to sit down and try to highlight issues before they come up, right? If you have a draft regulation and the membership, you know, has the ability to comment on whether it adheres, in their view, to WTO obligations, and you can forestall some problems through these types of exchanges in these committee meetings. And then, of course, there are formal reviews of national trade policies where, again, members get to question another member's trade regime. And that's all enormously valuable to keep this kind of dialogue going in between the negotiating function and to avoid overuse of that dispute settlement function. And of course, the WTO in recent years, maybe not so recent, it's been going on for a couple of decades now, has really established a very well-established trade capacity building program in partnership with other international organizations like the World Bank. So you can move on to the next slide if you would. One of the things I think Inu will get into later is the dynamics in the negotiations and membership and its composition. And essentially what you see here in this slide is that the WTO is sort of a victim of its own success. What happens over the years, these are the rounds of negotiations, formal multilateral rounds. And what you can see very obviously is the enormous growth in the value of trade that's involved. What happens over the years is you move from straight tariff negotiations to adding non-tariff barriers, anti-dumping measures, subsidies, complex rules. And so you've got a lot more, and then you add services and you add agriculture to the mix, which hadn't been covered in previous rounds. And all of a sudden you've got the scope of what's involved, the value of what's involved, growing exponentially with each subsequent round. And then when you also see in the last column is that the number of members grew precipitously in the across the last few rounds. You go from the core 23 initially to now we're up to 164, right? So that means in a consensus-based organization, it's a big challenge to reach consensus just by looking at this sheer sort of the numbers of this. And you can move to the next slide. And just to put a finer point on that, Doha, we didn't conclude Doha, obviously. At the start of Doha, merchandise trade globally was about 6 trillion. Now it's 19 trillion. Services trade was 1.5 trillion. Now it's almost 6 trillion. And as I said, the membership had continued to grow. So the complexity is not going away, and it needs to be dealt with. And the composition, which I think Inu is going to talk about more, means that you have many more developing countries than you do developed countries, right? And those developing countries are not monolithic either. They're all in different sizes, different states of development. So you've got all that sort of dynamics going on in the background. All right, do I have one more? I forget, do I have one more slide? There we go. Okay, so then I'll just finish with this, which is, I want to talk about these 5 areas because I mentioned the core values of the WTO, and I think these 5 to me are really the core things that you want to take away. If you want to describe the legacy of trade policy since 1947, the core essence of any trade agreement really, as a result of WTO, these 5 things appear in any free trade agreement, whether it's regional, bilateral, and I'll go through each one, but you can take these away and then maybe we'll be able to see each other and chat a little bit more, and I'll just touch on each one. So first of all, procedural fairness and transparency. This is a really underrated area again, but the WTO requires governments to publish, to notify members, to make their regulations understandable, in languages, in multiple languages, to publish it, to make it accessible. And it sounds really commonplace now, and it is, of course. We have the internet, and but we shouldn't take these procedures for granted. And we use them in the United States. We use a lot of developed countries had them, but there's a ton of pull through that happened over the years for developing countries that now have these best practices in place. And what it does essentially is allow people to trade, right? They can understand the rules before they enter the market. Things don't change in an opaque way. It's all available for comment and it's published, and that is enormously important to individuals and firms who trade. The second thing is non-discrimination, right? So the core principles of the WTO, non-discrimination, it means in 2 different ways. In the United States, if it has a cell phone coming in from Korea and from China, and it's fundamentally the same cell phone, you cannot discriminate between those 2 cell phones, whether it's coming from China or from South Korea. You also cannot provide better treatment domestically, to domestic companies than you do to foreign companies. So these are really important principles of non-discrimination. And when you layer those 2 things, the procedural fairness and non-discrimination, into the way that members offer market access in goods, in services, intellectual property, et cetera, now you've got a really potent, right, combination and approach that was innovated within the WTO that is applied in every trade agreement. I wanted to mention exceptions briefly, just because I think it's really important, because you have this sort of safety valve that's built in, that was always built in from the beginning of GATT, because they understood that there may be times and circumstances for reasons of national security or to protect human, animal, plant life, to protect exhaustible natural resources, for example, when it's necessary to deviate from some of these principles in order to achieve a legitimate public objective. And even there, it has constraints built in the way that you might do that, right? Least trade restrictive, no more trade restrictive than necessary, these kinds of principles. So the reason that's so important is because it gives governments, right, the ability to govern, to regulate the way they need to. And it also means, right, we don't give up our right to regulate, but it also means that you retain that sovereignty, which I think is so important to, the way Americans perceive international institutions, is that, at the end of the day, even if you lose a fight in the WTO, you still have sovereignty to make decisions that are in the interest of your own people. And then lastly, enforcement. This is a hot topic. It's not the only thing in the WTO that needs reforming right now, but it is a key area. And so much of what I've just described, the procedural fairness, non-discrimination, market access, all of that, becomes enshrined in domestic law. That's where it lives. But it is now also strongly normative, right? So it is thought of in the way that governments go about regulating before you ever get to a dispute settlement. You think about the non-discrimination elements, et cetera, and your obligations. And so you do that because you want to, and so for the most part, when you look at the caseload, the system's working really well, but it doesn't always work, right? There are going to be times when governments take measures that are represent violations of their obligations. And in that case, the dispute settlement system has worked really well as a preventative approach. It induces consultations, but it also allows for binding resolution of these disputes when you need it. So, you know, I think to me, honestly, when you're going to make the case to the American public, when you describe all of these things together, to me, it looks a lot like the American system. It aligns really well with the American goals of protecting fundamental economic freedoms, of having transparent rules, of having, you know, a sense of basic fairness built into the system. And if it's faltering, if it hasn't kept pace, we have the ability to negotiate improvements. We don't have to withdraw. We can negotiate improvements with principled leadership and creativity, and that protects our ability to control our destiny, but we have to engage. And if we have real concerns, as we do, about China and whether China fits into the system, then it is most productive to try to make these changes within the system, because if we withdraw, I think China benefits the most. And so I might, and I think that's the next administration, whether it's a second term of President Trump or it's Joe Biden, they're going to have to wrestle with this question of whether China and its approach fundamentally, you know, is it a square peg in a round hole here with the WTO? Does it fit, or are we at a place where, you know, we need to ask some serious questions about whether, you know, either the WTO reforms or we have an existential problem as to whether, you know, China actually fits with the system that I've just described. And that's a question for either president, either administration. So I'll leave it there and let Inu pick up from there and let Barbara continue.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, so much. This was very enlightening and indeed a picture of the complexity of this. And to delve deeper into that complexity, Inu, could I please ask you to share with us your thoughts about some of the particular challenges or some of the aspects of these challenges that you consider particularly relevant?
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you to Leslie and Ursula for inviting me here today. I really look forward to the discussion. So I'm going to dive into the number of issues that the United States has flagged as part of its WTO reform agenda. But I'm going to talk about three main challenges that I think are facing the WTO right now that will need to be addressed regardless, as Andrea said, of what happens in the November presidential election. So the first of these is actually the appellate body crisis. Now, the appellate body is the WTO's highest court, where countries can appeal rulings made by the so-called lower courts panels. But unlike panels, which vary by dispute, the appellate body is made up of 7 jurists that serve 4-year terms. Now, once their term expires, the countries that make up the WTO have to nominate new judges by consensus. At the end of last year, we were down to just 1 single judge, and you need at least 3 to hear an appeal. So this means that the appeal system basically does not work. This is a major problem when roughly 70% of all WTO disputes that go through the panel process get appealed. So imagine if you couldn't appeal a case that went to trial. Imagine that the US Supreme Court couldn't hear cases right now. This would be a serious problem. You would either need to accept the ruling of the lower court or negotiate a deal with the other party. This also puts a lot of pressure on the lower courts to get rulings right, or to avoid ruling on some claims altogether, knowing that they cannot be corrected later on by the appeals court. So essentially, without this appeals court, there is no final interpretation on matters of WTO law. Now, the reason we don't have a functioning appeals mechanism right now is because the United States has been blocking the appointment of any new judges. Why are they doing this? Well, because the United States has had some very long-standing concerns about the appellate body and how it functions. So for example, the US has claimed that the appellate body has treated past rulings as precedent when there is no formal system for precedent in international law. This is because decisions by international courts only have binding force on the parties to a dispute and on that particular case. But in many ways, when you think about it, informal precedent is unavoidable, as judges will always look to past cases to help ensure consistency in their rulings. Now, there are a number of other concerns as well, such as the US claim that the appellate court has overreached in its interpretation of the law. Now, some see this as the US simply being upset about losing a select number of past cases that some might be familiar with here. But this is to say that, there's a lot of concerns they've raised. Some of them are incredibly valid and important, such as, the appeals court taking far too long to issue rulings. It is a huge problem. But I think it's worth discussing these issues. And the US has really started that conversation, perhaps not in the way that people wanted it to, but they definitely started it. And I think in general, though, it's important to keep in mind that the appellate body has been incredibly valuable to the world trading system in general, and the United States in particular, creating a very high degree of predictability and consistency in its rulings. Furthermore, if you look at the record of US disputes at the WTO, the US wins nearly all the cases it brings. Now, this is reflective of the pro-complainant bias of the organization, simply because members don't really tend to bring cases unless they're absolutely certain they're going to win. And that's one reason for that. Now, going back to AB reform, if we look at what happened last year, through all of the year, we had a really strong effort to address US concerns. It was led by New Zealand's representative, David Walker, and he had some principles that he put forward that really touched upon some of the major 6 issues that the United States had, but the US has really persisted in its objections. At the moment, what we're left with is no appeals court whatsoever, and 23 members of the WTO, and I count the EU as one, basically have decided to set up a separate appeals mechanism, but this is a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem. So that's the first big challenge, and solving this is going to be imperative for the dispute settlement mechanism to function at all. The second bigger challenge, I think, is that of developing country status. How do we differentiate between a very large block of developing countries that vary significantly in their levels of development? Now, the WTO is a little bit of an oddity among international organizations for how it handles developing countries. Historically, development was really not a major consideration because the makeup of the membership, as Andrea outlined, really leaned towards the developed world. But as that membership expanded, there were growing calls to address this developed-developing divide. And as early as 1955, the members of the GATT, which preceded the WTO, included for the first time the concept of non-reciprocity, meaning that not every member would have to give in negotiations as much as it was going to get. Now, over the years, this issue became far more prominent, though there was never an attempt by the WTO to define what qualified as a developing country. So this is sort of where that oddity begins, though. In the WTO, countries self-declare that they are developing. This means that you're a developing country if you say you are. Now, until very recently, South Korea held on to its developing country status. Now, for the consumers of K-pop and K-beauty, let me tell you, this is kind of weird, and so just sit with that for a while. But then what do you get? What is the benefit of being a developing country in the WTO? It's a little variety of things. Sometimes there's flexibility in the commitments that you make as part of negotiations, longer time frames to implement rules, technical assistance, for example. And the WTO has noted 183 provisions in the current agreements that provide for special status for developing countries, what is called special and differential treatment as the technical term. Now, the complication really arises in the present day, where we've had no successful multilateral negotiations. That is a negotiation between all 164 members of the WTO. And it is because we simply can't agree. And some large emerging markets continue to hide behind special and differential treatment, for example. When you think about it, like when some large markets don't take on the same level of commitment as other large markets, we definitely have a problem. No one's gonna give the exact same amount. And it's not just about the entire market, for example, that's the problem. So one country could be developing in one industry, but maybe not in another one. So should it be considered a developing country in negotiations where it makes up a substantial percentage of world trade in the product under negotiation? That's a big question that the United States has raised as part of this reform agenda. Now, a point worth noting in all of this is that for least developed countries, there is a very clear metric, which is used by the UN and the WTO, and it's based on GNI per capita of 1,025 or less. There are 47 countries on that list, and the US does not want to touch that and doesn't want to address that issue because it's not really a problem. They're a really special case. But the problem actually lies with countries that have a greater share of world trade or a high GNI per capita on par with so-called developed countries that still consider themselves to be developing. The United States has pointed out countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Israel, Kuwait, the UAE, Brunei Darussalam, Qatar, and also South Korea. So when you think about these countries, they don't really strike you as being in the developing category necessarily. The United States has basically argued that these countries should not be eligible for the same flexibility, for example, as you are granted some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which in theory, they are treated as in the same category when it comes to negotiations. But this really disadvantages the poorest members of the WTO, because it takes the focus away from development and instead turns negotiations into battles of who is exempt from certain rules. So not meeting a commitment doesn't really help these countries reach their development goals at the end of the day. And the special treatment that WTO affords actually can end up backfiring. And in fact, research that I've done with my colleague James Baucus has shown that there really is not clear benefit that we could ever find about special and differential treatment. We can't really look at a value metric that tells us that countries have actually improved their development outcomes by using this. Now, the US actually put forward its proposal to address this problem in 2019, but it began airing the antecedents of its current views as early as the 1970s. So these concerns have a very long history. And the Trump administration has been more aggressive in its approach, but they have been able to restart an important conversation about the issue. This is incredibly relevant now in particular, as the WTO is actually in the process of a multilateral negotiation on fisheries subsidies, which I can talk about later, where some of the largest subsidizers are developing countries. So for those negotiations to succeed and for the WTO to continue being a functioning negotiating body, this issue definitely has to be resolved. And then finally, I'll mention one more final third challenge, and it's more of a general one actually. As I mentioned earlier, the WTO has not succeeded in negotiating any new multilateral deals. This is not really a failure of the institution, in my opinion, but rather a failure of its membership. The political will to conclude ambitious multilateral agreements died with the Doha round, which really never came to fruition. Now, part of the reason for this was that there were a lot of old issues that came to the fore, a lot of which had to do with the level of commitments countries signed up for when the WTO was founded, including the challenge of a developing country status. This is why very rich countries in the WTO have protections for agriculture and textiles, for example, still areas where developing countries would most benefit from liberalization. But I would also say that in the last few years, something else has been revealed, maybe a little bit more troubling, something that has been simmering beneath the surface for quite some time. And that is that in the absence of US leadership, the institution really struggles to find a way forward. Members remain very divided on a number of large issues. And a prominent one of the last few years, as Andrea also mentioned, was the issue of China, whether the WTO can accommodate a non-market economy as large as that one. Building consensus is incredibly difficult with 164 countries, but if we can't agree on a set of priorities for the world trading system, I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So finding a way forward on this is going to be incredibly important, especially as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, as countries have rushed to put in place export restrictions on products, and we have some threats that there's not going to be sharing of a vaccine once it's developed. These are issues that the WTO should be at the heart of discussing, and without a functioning WTO, I think we will face some pretty big challenges going forward. So I'm going to leave my comments there and turn it back to you, Barbara.
And Barbara has just written me a note. We have, I think, lost her, unfortunately, as she works to rejoin us. Let's see here. She had given me some of her questions. Let's see here. Okay. Sorry, everyone. I just wasn't prepared to, let's see here. Why don't we transition to the leadership race? We have 8 candidates that are vying to lead this important organization and tackle the major challenges that Inu just enumerated. We have 3 women among the group. And could you just talk a little bit about how you see any one of the new leaders handling these types of challenges? In other words, what is the role of the Director General in sort of trying to bridge these gaps? Are they actively involved? Is it more of a political leadership? Do they actively, get at the table and negotiate? What are the different models of how a director general could lead this organization? I don't know, Andrea, if you want to start. Let's just see if we have gotten our friend back. No. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the leadership race, and hopefully Barbara will be back soon.
Yeah, I think she's working on it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is very personality driven. And I know that there are a lot of views out there about whether the person needs to be, less of a technical expert and more of somebody who has real political standing, who can, galvanize leaders around the world. They don't have to. They do a lot of brokering, but it's not necessarily that they're not inside the words on the page at all times. It's really a matter of ensuring that you bring the right people together at the right time, that you're being communicative, that you're being inclusive, that the whole process is seen as fair. There's a lot of Harvard business studies out there about how people will accept the outcome of a negotiation, even if they don't totally agree with it or it wasn't their desired outcome, if they think that the whole process was fairly run. So to me, I think this is going to have to be somebody who can really galvanize the members around the core proposition of the WTO, the core value of the WTO, recognizing that life has changed. We just can't continue on the same trajectory. The global skepticism of this institution of all global institutions is pretty real and serious. So you can't just rest on legacy. You have to communicate that value. You can't just, again, try to continue on that trajectory. The organization itself just has to move faster, and it's going to have to operate differently, which means I think you need somebody who's a real change manager, somebody who's a little bit more business oriented in some way, who is a good communicator, who is a visionary, but who also keeps in mind that this is not a vanity project for those of us who work in trade policy. This matters for people who trade. And I've listened to some of those interviews, and you mentioned the women. I didn't hear the interview Wida did with the South Korean candidate, but did participate in interviews with the Nigerian and Kenyan candidates. They're very impressive women. No doubt they can have a handle on the technical detail, but more importantly, I think they really know how to operate in international negotiations, could engender trust and faith among the membership that that they're being fair and open and inclusive. But I think even more important than all of that, they're pragmatic. I think that's one thing that the women will probably bring to this that maybe the men, don't have as much of, which is that women tend to just be much more pragmatic. And I heard both of those women talk very specifically about who all of this is for, and they always mentioned individuals, whether they are in developed countries or developing countries. And if you keep that at the heart of this discussion, I think you come out with a better outcome than if you allow the politics of this to drive the day, but you can't ignore those politics. So those are qualities you're going to need in that person.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I do agree that there's an argument to be made for a much bolder director general than what we've had in the past. Now, as Azevedo has done a really good job, notably helping to conclude the trade facilitation agreement, which was really a big feat. But we may need a different type of DG to address the big challenges we're facing now, as Andrea mentioned, because we have to revitalize negotiations, we have to fix the monitoring function and dispute settlement. I think that there's a distinct possibility that the next leader will be female this time. The three candidates that we have in the running are truly exceptional, have a strong understanding of present trade challenges, and appear really willing to effectuate change and to dive into the details of things. But again, it's an administrative role, but the DG still has a lot of influence in sort of setting the tone for the organization. And I think a really reform-minded person would be great here. Now, we have a lot of great candidates to choose from, but I think one thing that's going to be important is that we do choose somebody from a developing country, particularly because the issues surrounding development are going to be really prominent going forward. And it would send a strong signal that the members take this issue very seriously.
Okay, let me just do a quick scan to see if we've got Barbara. Oh, good, yes. Okay, Barbara, if you could unmute. Oh, shoot. Barbara, if you can unmute yourself, we can't hear you. We're glad to have you back, though.
I'm very sorry. I'm so sorry. You know.
No problem. We took up
on the phone.
Oh, okay. And we just covered the race, and we got some views from Andrea and Inu about sort of the kind of leader that may be needed, the characteristics of that person, and a little bit on the qualities that a woman leader might bring to the role. So we've touched on that. We have not yet touched on a couple of the other topics that I know you plan to raise today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for covering up for me, and really
Sure.
sorry to everyone. You know how this crazy times go. So I'm glad that you got a chance to discuss that. I'll have to see the recording because I really wanted to see what they said about the women leadership in the WTO. But I would also like to ask Andrea to comment on the dynamics of different levels of negotiation within the organization, because as you mentioned previously, you have 160 plus members trying to negotiate an agreement. So that's one like big level of consensus, but there are also negotiations that take place at bilateral or plurilateral levels. So how does this work, and what are the implications for that? Andrea, could you share a little more about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, there are maybe a couple of things to be said, and I'm sure, we'll play cleanup for everything I've missed, but anytime you negotiate outside the WTO, it is considered an exception to your WTO rules. And so you do have to adhere to certain criteria for those agreements. You can't erect new barriers to parties outside of that agreement. You have to get to market access within a reasonable amount of time. So there are some requirements the WTO puts on, although they don't really enforce it. And no doubt, there's been a huge proliferation of negotiations outside of the WTO over the last decade. And in particular, there's no region in the world, almost no country, that doesn't have a bilateral agreement. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, in the meta sense, I'm looking at this week because tomorrow is 9/11. There are data that show that, if you have an agreement and increased trade, bilateral flows among two countries, they are less likely to fight with one another. So there's lots of good reasons for countries to engage in negotiations with neighbors, the NAFTA, intra-regional trade within Africa. Unlocking that is a huge benefit to the countries involved, but also the rest of the world. So lots of good reasons to work on, different planes here. When I worked for Robert Zoellick at USTR, he used to call it a competition in liberalization. That, the more you did, it wasn't exclusive. The more you did one, the more you sort of stimulated another, so that they could all be kind of mutually reinforcing. But there is another view to this, which is that, those countries that are not involved in those outcomes may be worse off, because by definition, a trade agreement is trade diverting. I mean, that's what you want. You're trying to increase trade among the parties, which means that you're going to have less trade among countries who, are no longer a party to that agreement. And in particular for developing countries, it's not a great proposition, because most of them are not a part of these, mega deals. They're not part of, the transatlantic discussions, the TPP, big deals like EU, Japan, et cetera. They're on the outside of that. And they have been relying for many years on one-way preferences. And you mentioned this, that it was non-reciprocal market access. And so if for years you had a benefit, of having zero duties in a US market, but now the US goes out and negotiates with large competitors of yours, and now they have zero too, the benefit of your preference has been eroded. So, for them and for most countries in the world, multilateral outcomes are the most beneficial. So, I mean, to the extent that you can have plurilaterals going, it's a made up word, this word plurilateral. Basically, right, you negotiate on information technology or services, and it's a critical mass of countries that want to do that. You can do it one of two ways. You can do it outside the WTO, or you can do it inside the WTO. My preference is to do it inside the WTO, or at a minimum state that you intend to multilateralize those plurilateral outcomes. But those countries are allowing free riders. They're allowing inside the WTO, they would be allowing anyone who's not party to the agreement to have the benefits without taking on the commitments. But that's not such a bad thing. I mean, there's I think it's not, I mean, the US has done that for many years. That's how it shows leadership. So, you know, it's a mix. I would say that the major downside you hear writers and academics talk about is the spaghetti bowl effect for companies, right? If you have so many agreements out there with different rules of origin and requirements and market access levels, it becomes very complex for users of these agreements. You know, it's not about the rest of us signing the deal and being happy. It's, can people use the agreements? And if businesses have trouble navigating the complexity of all these different deals out there, there's diminishing returns in that too. So, you know, but nations need to make a strategy, and if things don't move in the WTO, no doubt they will continue to negotiate bilaterally and regionally.
Right. And there is another issue that keeps coming up in all this discussion of the challenges and of the things that need to be worked out if the WTO is to have a future and such. I'm not sure, you know, if after I disconnected, you were able to touch on this at the end of your previous comment, but if you didn't, and I'm sorry, could you talk a little more about the fisheries issue? It's coming up all over the place, and it's fairly technical. So could you help us understand a little bit more about this?
Sure. So I'll start first with, you know, answering what are these subsidies? They're financial contributions by governments or public bodies which confer some sort of benefit onto whom they're given. And subsidies create a lot of market distortions by aiding some businesses and industries over others, diverting resources from those businesses and industries preferred by the market to those selected by policymakers. Now, what are the fisheries subsidies in particular issue in the WTO negotiations? If you look at the largest subsidies for fisheries, it's actually fuel subsidies, which account for 22% of all fishery subsidies. And this allows vessels to range far beyond their coastal waters and to fish for much longer than they otherwise would. There's a lot of other subsidies as well, such as subsidies to construct and purchase new vessels, free facilities to land fish, and subsidies to buy, transport, or store fishing equipment. Each of these subsidies basically makes it less costly and more profitable to fish, thereby encouraging more fishing than otherwise would be the case without these subsidies in place. So the problem that these negotiations are trying to solve is to ensure the long-term sustainability of our oceans by disciplining the use of these subsidies that contribute to overfishing. Now, global fish stocks, if you look at the biologically sustainable levels over time, they've fallen from 90% in 1974 to about 66% in 2015. And they're going to continue to decrease if we do nothing. But interestingly, the top 5 providers of fishery subsidies account for 58% of all global fish subsidies. And these markets are China, the European Union, the United States, South Korea, and Japan. Now, one of the big challenges in these negotiations has been the fact that China still claims to be a developing country and wants developing country status as part of the negotiations. And this has really been a hindrance to achieving a more ambitious set of commitments. Now, China isn't the only country that wants to be able to maintain its ability to subsidize. India also wants to do this, although it itself does not provide many subsidies, but it might want to in the future. So it's trying to carve out some policy space here to get some exemptions from these rules. Now, developing countries, when you look at these negotiations, have in some ways the most to win and the most to lose, as they depend on fish for both livelihoods and food far more than the developed world does. Now, if they don't take on big commitments and ambitious commitments, I think it's going to be kind of a self-inflicted wound that in the long term it's going to overall affect the sustainability of our oceans. This is not a very typical WTO negotiation because it deals with bigger issues of development and sustainability, which the WTO really hasn't grappled with in any negotiation before. So if members can't wrap this up, I think it really is going to signal that the end of any future multilateral rules at the WTO. I mean, this should be a very easy, low-hanging fruit thing to deal with. You know, we're looking at illegal subsidies on fishing. This really should be something we should be able to come together on this year. But there's a lot of challenges. And if the big 5 subsidizers can't agree, I think we're in quite big trouble, I think, going forward.
I think your answer opens up so many follow-up questions on the immediate future, but I'll hold to them because we don't have that much time. And I do see that there are a couple of questions, in the chat. And one of them is actually one that I had planned on asking Andrea particularly, but both of you please feel free to comment on this, which is the role of China. The question we're getting is about the quarrels between China and the United States, which seem to lessen the importance of the organization, at least from a public opinion's viewpoint, and what could be said to counter this argument. But that was something I was always also trying to ask of you. The role of China in all of this, and the larger question of the subsidies that Inu was mentioning. How all this relates, I think Inu has pointed out to some of that, but is there anything else, Andrea, that you would like to add to that? Because this is a very particular issue here at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a couple of things. Number one, I think this speaks to the need to operate. Part of the question that was asked was, does it mean that there's a diminishment of the WTO's relevance if the U.S. is going after this, so directly bilaterally? And I think the answer is no to that. Even under a Trump administration, no. And the U.S. should not leave the playing field, right? The U.S. built the WTO. China will not necessarily be able to lead in the WTO, but if you look at their intentional aggressive strategy in leading key UN organizations, it is unprecedented to have one country at the head of 4 different key economic global institutions: the FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Civil Aviation, Telecommunications, and the Industrial Development Organization. This gives them enormous leverage over the regulatory environment in key sectors. It gives them enormous leverage over the funds that go to developing countries. And the U.S. needs to hold on to the WTO for a counterpoint in the economic realm, because the WTO is vital in that regard. And I don't think, when you look at their strategy, this administration's strategy anyway, yes, they went aggressively bilaterally to try to get commitments, but they also worked with the EU and with Japan on trilateral statements. And when you look at the evolution of those trilateral statements, they were actually starting to trot out and preview the way new subsidies provisions could look in the WTO, which is a way of negotiating. You start to, put out white papers, and it starts to get a little more specific. That's what those documents do. And then at the same time in the USMCA, they built in provisions that were not, yes, they address some state-owned issues with regard to Mexico and Canada, but really those were designed to preview an approach toward China and to start to get some countries on side and have these agreements, commitments embedded formally in a trade agreement. And it's an evolution from TPP, which is also another way of socializing this and sort of multilateralizing it indirectly. So I think I think the U.S. is taking an all of the above approach to this.
Thank you. And I'd like to take the very last minutes that we have for a final question that was made by Leslie on the chat, which of course is at the core of everything that we're living now. And it's the effect of the pandemic, which has left us to see the importance of trade, of an efficient trade for medical supplies mainly, but also for food and for many other things. So how, maybe Inu, could you give us briefly your thoughts on what the role of the WTO would be in facilitating trade at a time like this? How would it have been different, maybe, if I may add, if the WTO had been in a better shape?
Great question. I think, we all wish the WTO was in better shape when this pandemic hit, because we did see a rush to implement a lot of export restrictions, scramble for PPE. And I think one thing that was heartening for me, actually, was to see the immediate response by the WTO to create a monitoring mechanism in a way to make sure that countries were notifying when they were taking measures. Now, not all countries notify. This is a very large problem in the monitoring function of the WTO, but the Secretariat basically started just scanning what countries were doing and posting that online. And this is a really good function that I think is continued, and it's really important that it maintains that sort of level of energy, because what we really need is to have transparency in all the measures that governments are taking, particularly when it's a time of crisis like this. And there's a lot of backroom deals going on to secure certain supplies, as we saw really early on here in the United States. So the WTO has a really big role in that, but then also just expanding negotiations in the realm of medical devices and medical supplies. Now, the US and the EU tried to settle on some, regulatory rules on this. Maybe we should have these discussions at the WTO. I don't know if it makes sense entirely for just the US and EU to having these discussions, and we should be involving other countries in it as well, because there are some major developing markets as well that are big powerhouses for creating lots of medicines now. We're not seeing that all being developed in the United States anymore. So I think that we do need to have a bigger discussion among the entire membership after this pandemic passes into flagging what are the main concerns. What did we learn from this, and how can we make our rules more resilient in the future? Because new multilateral rules are the only way that we're going to be able to weather this type of storm again in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to Andrea as well, and to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to the New England Women in Trade group, and make sure to look for the recording of the session, where you can see me pop off and then pop back in. And thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to our speakers, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.